Seth, Dreams and Projection of Consciousness by Jane Roberts. Introduction by Robert F. Butts. Published in 1987 by Still Point Publishing. Read by Martin John. Part 1. Intrusions from the Interior Universe. Continuation Part 1, Number 4. My First Glimpse of Dream Reality. A blundering trance, two fugitives from the dream world. Seth did mention Rob's vision in the next 13th session on January 6, 1964. We began this one with the Ouija board. Rob said aloud, "Seth, can you tell me anything about the vision I had 2 nights ago?" The pointer spelled out, "Lauren. The man was a monk on a pilgrimage." "My brother, Lauren? Where was he traveling to?" "He was on his way to the Holy Lands. His shoes had been stolen as he slept. The buildings you saw were not pyramids, but the ruins of monasteries in the distance." "In what land was this?" Rob asked. The pointer replied, "Asia was where you saw him, though he was in many other places, traveling in his middle years, doing penance for his sins according to the customs of the age." "Was I alive then?" Rob asked. "No." "Will you tell us what mental enzymes are? You mentioned them once before in a past session. I guess I'd rather learn more about that right now," Rob said. Now, as Seth, I shoved the board aside and began to dictate. As mental genes are behind the physical genes, so to speak, so are mental enzymes behind the physical stuff you can examine on your plane. Chlorophyll is such a mental enzyme, and there are more which I will describe to you at a later date. In a sense, any color or quality of that nature could be considered a mental enzyme. There is an exchange of sorts between the mental and physical without which, for example, color could not exist. I use color here as an example because it is perhaps easier to understand how this could be a mental enzyme than it is to perceive the same thing about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is green in more than color, incidentally. Nevertheless, there is an interaction here which gives chlorophyll its properties. I hope to make this clearer to you, but it involves part of a larger concept for which you do not have the proper background. Chlorophyll is a mental enzyme, however, and it is one of the moving forces in your planes. A variant exists in all other planes. It is a mental spark, so to speak, that sets everything else into motion. This has to do with feeling, which is also a mover. You must try not to categorize things in old ways, but when you open your mind, you will see a similarity between chlorophyll as a mental enzyme or mover and emotion, which is never still. Emotion, solidified, is something else again and is perhaps a framework of other worlds. And really, Jane, you're giving your subconscious an awful lot of credit. Let's see credit where credit is due. I suggest you take a break." Rob laughed at the remark about my subconscious. But instead of giving us a rest period, Seth went on for a moment. Perhaps I may be able to make mental enzymes clearer. In your own experience, you are familiar with steam, water, and ice. These are all manifestations of the same thing. So can a seemingly physical chlorophyll be also a part of a seemingly immaterial emotion or feeling, but in a different form. And, of course, directed into this form or caused to take various forms in response to certain laws. As your ice will not exist of itself in the middle of your summertime. And if I'm not to be compared to a symphony, Joseph, you must admit that I do well with a figurative baton. Here we took our break. Rob always enjoyed Seth's sense of humor, and he was still smiling at the last remark when I came out of trance. He called me Joseph again, he said. Serve you right, I said, grinning. Seth referred to me as Rupert and Rob as Joseph, saying that these were our entity names. The entity is the whole self who experiences many reincarnations. I didn't like either name too well, so we used to joke about them. We didn't have time to say much, however, because Seth came back in about 10 minutes. During the break, Rob had made a remark about solidified emotion, and Seth began by saying, "Why do you find the phrase solidified emotion or feeling outlandish? You both understand now that your plane is composed of solidified thought. When your scientists get through all of their high fiddle-faddle, they will also discover that this is the case. I told you earlier to imagine the wire structure penetrating everything that is. I meant you to imagine these wires as being alive, as I am a live wire myself. Joking aside, I will now ask you to imagine these wires as being composed of the solidified emotion of which I have just spoken. Surely you must know that the words feeling or emotion are, at best, symbols to describe something else, and that something else comes extremely close to your mental enzymes. Actually, a counteraction within a mental enclosure occurs. A mental enclosure divides itself in two, splits up, multiplies, acts upon its own various parts, and this produces a material manifestation. The material is material, yet it is mentally produced. The mental enzymes within the enclosure are the elements that set off the action, and, listen to this, they are also the action itself. In other words, the mental enzymes not only produce action in the material world, but they become the action. If you will read over the above 3 or 4 paragraphs, you will come close to seeing where mental and physical becomes one. You both know what love and hate are, but as I told you earlier, try to think in new ways. Love and hate, for example, are action. They are action, and they both imply action in physical bodies. These mental enzymes, to go back to them, are solidified feeling, but not in the terms that you usually use. I have said that our imaginary wires that seem to penetrate our model universe are alive. And now, if you bear with me, I will say that they are mental enzymes or solidified feelings, always in motion, and yet permanent enough to form a more or less consistent framework. You could almost say that mental enzymes become the tentacles that form material, though I do not find that a very pretty phrase. The framework, again, is only for convenience, as your physical walls are for your convenience, as I mentioned earlier. The walls are not there as such, but you had better act as if they were, or suffer a possible broken neck. I must still respect many like frameworks in my own plane, but my understanding of them renders them less opaque. Intellectual truth will not make you free, you see, though it is a necessary preliminary. If this were the case, your walls would fall away, since, intellectually, you understand their rather dubious nature. Since feeling is so often the cohesive with which mind builds, it is feeling itself which must be changed if you would find freedom from your particular plane of existence at your particular time. That is, changing feeling will allow you to see variance. These discussions now are, of necessity, of a simple and uncomplicated nature. If I speak in analogies and images, it is because I must relate with the world that is familiar to you. This session actually lasted from 9 p.m. until midnight, so only excerpts have been given here. The material on mental enzymes intrigued us. Looking back, we can see what a chore it must have been for Seth to introduce us to ideas that were very basic to him and quite new to us. Much later, he was to give some excellent material on the nature of physical matter and its mental components. But at the time of this session, he told us all we could understand, while he began slowly to build up the necessary background and concepts. The session had begun on December 2nd, 1963. This was still only the middle of January of 1964. We were trying other experiments on our own, some like the example given earlier, some entirely different. Mornings, I worked on my book. Afternoons were spent at the gallery. If it wasn't a session night, after dinner and an hour's poetry, we tried other experiments. Rob spent a good deal of the time typing the sessions, as he still does. He couldn't do much more without cutting down on his own painting hours, so I often did experiments on my own while he was in the studio. By now, we were both convinced that the human mind or consciousness had abilities and methods of perception far beyond those we had thought possible. If this was the case, then my consciousness possessed these potentials, and I was determined to discover their nature and extent. I never considered them supernormal, or rather supernatural. On the other hand, it never occurred to me that there was any other way to study consciousness except by studying my own. A journey into subjectivity seemed, and still seems, as valid as a journey into objectivity. Because we were so innocent about psychic literature, we weren't hampered by superstitious fears about such phenomenon. I didn't believe in gods or demons, so I didn't fear them. I wanted to learn. Rob and I had discovered a whole new world together, and we were going to explore it. There was a constant battle, though, as some of our results ran full tilt into my intellectual ideas. In the beginning, I took it for granted that Seth was a subconscious fantasy, personified, because I simply couldn't accept the possibility of spirits, or, for that matter, life after death. Then, after it became obvious that the Seth sessions were going to continue, we kept constant check on my personality characteristics and went to a psychologist, as any sane, red-blooded American would do under such circumstances in those days. Seth seemed far more mature and well-balanced than the psychologist, so I finally stopped worrying. Besides, my personality showed no adverse signs of instability. If anything, I was more competent in handling physical affairs. This is not to say that the experience did not cause certain strains and stresses that could accompany any worthwhile venture in an entirely new field. One episode in particular is funny in retrospect. Looking back, it was certainly undisciplined, but at least it was not overshadowed by superstitious fears about demons, and it led to the episode with which I will close the first portion of this book. The event was a deep trance experience into which I blundered. A second experience convinced me of the high validity of dream existence, for in it a dream was split open while I watched. One night, while Rob was busy in the studio, I decided to experiment with a crystal ball. Since I didn't have one, I substituted a lovely blue bottle which was filled with water and into which I stared intently for a good half hour. Just as I finished, Rob came out to see what I was up to. According to him, I had been too quiet. I laughed and said, "Well, there's nothing to crystal gazing. All I saw was what you could expect. Lights and reflections and things. I guess you can't win them all, as they say." And I plunked myself down in our wooden rocker. In the next moment, a fascinating series of events occurred that were to culminate in the third dream state experience mentioned earlier in this book. I'm going to quote the notes I wrote the following day. In this way, our attitude toward the events at the time becomes obvious. After staring into the bottle, I began talking with Rob in the living room. I mentioned being able to put myself in a disassociated state at the gallery when things got sticky, and said that this saved lots of effort on my part. As I spoke, my voice seemed to get hoarse and husky. I laughed and commented that I hoped Seth wasn't going to start using my voice whenever he wanted to. As nearly as I can recall, it was then that I began to feel strange, as if something were going to happen. I put the feeling down as due to imagination. Almost at once, I felt drowsy and sat in the rocker, without rocking. My eyelids were very heavy, my head slumped sideways. I could hardly keep awake, but my senses were extremely acute. I could hear every sound in the house. Rob asked me what was wrong. I answered that I felt odd and unlike myself. My body then was very light, weightless to me, anyway. I wasn't conscious of any muscular weight or pressure at all. My arms and shoulders felt like water or air. Rob told me to get up. He was beginning to look worried, but I could hardly rise from the chair. He had to help me to the couch. I didn't feel physical enough to move. I could tell that I was heading into a very deep trance state. On the one hand, I was tempted to go along with it, since I was supposed to be experimenting. Along the way, I was able to maintain my present state without going deeper, but I didn't know how to snap out of the present state. Rob made coffee for me. I didn't believe I could lift the cup. When I finally did, my motions were extremely slow, as in a slow motion picture. Rob made me drink 2 cups of coffee. He had me stand with my head out of the kitchen window in the cold night air, but nothing seemed to help. I just seemed to be in a weightless body in which I had little interest. By now I was rather frightened, yet I thought that I could snap out of it if I really exerted all of my willpower, or knew how. Rob thought the concentration of writing a statement of how I felt would help. Instead, my efforts showed what a crazy state I was in. My handwriting just wasn't my own. Hardly any pressure was exerted on the pen. The writing was wavery, small, and grew progressively smaller. The prose expression was nothing like mine. It was very childish. Thoughts or messages poured to mind, and I wrote them down in this weird, unedited script. I was sitting at my desk when I began to feel funny. I don't know how. Then I sat in another chair and felt funnier. My hands felt very light, and so did my shoulders. Light, then as if it were not there at all. I do feel strange, though, no doubt about it. Rob says I'm just wiggling my fingers. Joseph. Just remember that Jerry is 66. This is a test taste. How do you like it? It's all right, silly sassy. Jerry went along, and no matter why he did it, no reason is necessary. You don't care, really. Fortissimo allegro. The notes are long overdue. Tell Mary so. She will want to know, and it is important. Hannah. My senses were still very acute. Vision and hearing. We decided that since I wasn't having much luck coming out of the trance, we might as well use it to do some experiments. Besides the handwriting, I tried the typewriter. This frightened me a bit further, since I couldn't exert enough pressure to use the keys. All this time I felt completely weightless, unable to function in the physical world. Because my motions were so strange, Rob had the impression that my limbs were heavy. To me, they were as light as air. I felt completely relaxed, and still my senses were sharp and clear as ever before. I was able to talk to Rob without difficulty also. When Rob felt my hand, it was wet and floppy, and my body seemed to have no physical resistance at all. Rob asked me to read the small print on the inside of a match cover and a few lines from a book. all held out much further than I could usually read, and I was able to do this quickly and without effort. My sight was much better than it is normally. While experimenting, we found that I could make a rapid, decisive motion if I exerted great mental force. Rob asked me to lift a coffee cup with a normal gesture. Earlier, he had held the cup up while I sipped the coffee. I concentrated as hard as I could on what he wanted me to do, which seemed hilarious to me, and an impossible task, and then really made a supreme physical effort. As a result, my hand jerked up high, suddenly, and then just as suddenly swung back, banging the cup back on the counter. Applied suggestion by Rob would have snapped me out of this state easily, but we didn't know that at the time. As it was, the condition lasted about 3 hours, ending only when we went to bed, past midnight. By then I was no longer frightened, but merely curious and trying with one part of my consciousness to find out what the other part was up to, and how it went about its business. Finally, I fell asleep, expecting nothing but exhausted slumber for the rest of the night. The next thing I knew, I was dreaming that 2 men stood by the bed, talking to me. They wore ordinary clothing, slacks, and sport jackets. Just then a loud noise awakened me. I sprang to a sitting position, instantly alert. Astonished, I saw the 2 men still standing there. Surely, I thought, this was some trick of perception. I was still dreaming and didn't realize it, perhaps. But I pinched myself and rubbed my eyes. Then, quickly, I closed my eyes and reopened them. The men were still there. As far as I could tell, they were perfectly solid and fully 3-dimensional. There was nothing ghostly about them. I was too amazed to speak. Seth had barely begun any discussion of the dream state realities, and I was at a complete loss. Both men were smiling as they stared at me. Obviously, they weren't intruders in the usual sense, and they were not at all threatening. Their presence was a complete impossibility, yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my senses. Finally, I just pulled the bed covers up to my chin and sat there, staring back at them. The next moment, they began to disappear before my startled eyes, from the outside edges as if the air was consuming them. If their appearance surprised me, this bit-by-bit disappearance was even more startling. As they vanished, I felt the strangest sense of loss. I knew that the men were as real as I was, and that I had glimpsed some other dimension of reality quite as valid as the one I knew. Through all of this, I hadn't thought to disturb Rob, who was sleeping soundly beside me. My attention was utterly focused on the events. Now, turning toward him, I remembered the noise that had awakened me. Hadn't it awakened him? Had there ever been a noise? Quickly, I rushed out of bed and opened the door into the next room. There on the floor, broken beyond repair, was a heavy flower pot, lying in a pile of dirt and knotted geranium roots. Willie, our cat, had knocked it off the windowsill. End. And that is the end of part 1. Peace, light, and love. Thank you, Jane Roberts and Robert F. Butts. Aloha.